Okay, thank you everybody for joining this Hiradox webinar on holistic security in practice. We're really excited to have 5 great presenters talking about their experiences and knowledge on holistic security. My name is Kristen Anton. I'm the Community Knowledge Manager for Hiradox, and I'll be facilitating along with some of my colleagues that I'll introduce in a minute. So just to give you a little background information on these webinars, this is an opportunity for defenders, trainers, and other intermediary organizations to share their experience, knowledge, and advice on putting holistic security into practice. For this format, we're going to be hearing from 5 practitioners who will present their own knowledge and experience on this topic, and then we're going to open it up for questions and discussion at the end. So just some housekeeping information for everybody. The webinar is public and it's being recorded. So please be careful what you share. Don't share any personal identifiable information. You can ask your questions in the Jitsi Meet chat box if that's working for you, or you can use Twitter using the Hiradox hashtag, or feel free to send me an email if that's more comfortable, if you want to be anonymous. And my email is kristen@hiradox, but you probably already have that in your email box. Just to note, if Jitsi Meet does crash, you can still watch the live stream and the recording on our website. It's that same post that shares the description of this webinar. If this fails, the presenters are going to move to another channel and we'll continue the live stream over there. So just be patient. But hopefully this works. Okay, so the topic today is holistic security in practice. I have a definition here that I've borrowed from the Holistic Security Manual. And it is that the holistic approach to security integrates self-care, well-being, digital security, and information security into traditional security management practices. So we know that human rights can be risky work. And defenders often face threats and attacks that can be physically and psychologically impactful to the defender and their family. So when it comes to taking steps to improve one's security, it's important to keep in mind how one's well-being is related to one's security and also related to the group's or organizational security. As we were going through the registration process for this webinar today, we have learned that the audience is interested in improving the practice of holistic security in their own organization. They're also hoping to learn best practices related to holistic security training and learn more about how intermediaries can support and protect human rights defenders. So we're going to do our best to try to cover as many of these topics as we can, but we hope that you'll ask specific questions at the end if there's something we haven't covered. So let me tell you about our presenters that we have today. The first presenter will be Dan O'Clooney. He is a consultant and facilitator on protection of human rights defenders and exploratory group member of the Initiative for Sustainable Action. And Daniel is going to talk about the background and some of the tenets of the holistic security concept. And then we'll hear from Nora Reamer, who's Senior Advisor on Policy, Research, and Training at Protection International. Nora will be talking about best practices for holistic security training. And then we'll hear from Sergey Smirnov, Natalia Solovyova, and Daniil Lipin. And they will all be sharing their presentation and they'll be talking about their experiences and knowledge working with human rights defenders in Russia. Sergey is a digital and holistic security trainer. Natalia is a psychologist and a trainer of trainers working with human rights defenders on holistic security. And Daniil is a lawyer and working on judicial and digital security aspects. And we also have some Herodox moderators on the call to help provide some support and gather questions, and also to pick up in case I, for some reason, drop off. There's me, I'm Kristen. We also have Manoush, Nora, Eric, and Daniel on the line. Oops. Okay, now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'll ask Dan to go ahead and share his, and go ahead and start your presentation. Okay, go ahead, Dan.
So what I was going to talk about is basically to give a little bit of historical context and kind of locate where holistic security as a concept came from, because it's not something that, I mean, in a sense, maybe the wording is only a few years old in terms of talking about holistic security, but it's something that actually has roots in collaboration with a number of existing communities and sort of ideas that have come before. And I think it's just useful for people to know that, because it will help to understand then what I think are some of the core tenets of holistic security. And I think it's pretty important to have that clear, because otherwise there's a danger that this becomes kind of a buzzword, and that's a little bit, that's very open to interpretation, and it certainly is something that's dynamic and alive. And I think it's very important that it remains, there remains kind of debate about how holistic security can be implemented in different types of interventions, and ultimately how we give the best support to human rights defenders. But it's also important that you're clear about certain things, certain sort of aspects of it. So that's what I'll get into, and I'll talk a little bit about maybe some minimums of what it means to implement that. But I think Nora goes into a bit more practical details about that in her presentation, so I won't go into too much detail about that. So yeah, so to begin with, sort of at the beginning, what is holistic security? I mean, fundamentally, what we're talking about is an approach to security and protection of human rights defenders, again, broadly defined. So we include a lot of journalists and obviously other types of rights defenders, like environmental rights defenders inside that. And yeah, it arose from an attempt, and through a number of different activities, to synthesize the best practices of a few different fields that are all relevant to security and protection of human rights defenders. So these are things that were in existence beforehand. So security management and protection strategies, there's already a lot of material out there on that for human rights defenders that came, I think, originally really from the humanitarian field. Self-care and psychosocial well-being, which developed afterwards, and I'll talk a little bit about, and digital security and information management. These were the three kind of fields, let's say, that we tried to bring together in an initial moment, and then something that became sort of sort of that we applied across the three fields. I'm missing a word there, is gender justice and an intersectional approach. So yeah, its objective, it's difficult to actually talk about a definition of security in general, and holistic security as well. That was a debate that we had, and I think just to arrive at a working definition, we talked about the well-being in action of human rights defenders at risk. So it's not it's not well-being in the sense of necessarily retiring yourself from activism and therefore having less risk, but actually managing to stay well and sort of maintain your autonomy as a human rights defender or an organization or a collective, while remaining active in defense of human rights and in promotion of human rights. So what are the strategies we need in order to do that, and what is a framework and a discourse and a series of tools that can help in that depending on the context, human rights defenders to achieve that. From our perspective, then holistic security has kind of a couple of axes, and one is, of course, the content. So what I just mentioned about having a framework, having a language, having a series of tools, which you cover through your interventions in support of human rights defenders, or as an internal process to a human rights organization or group or collective. And then the other thing is the process. So how do you actually behave, especially as somebody who's externally facilitating growth in terms of in terms of protection of human rights defenders. So they're the kind of two sides of it, and I'll talk about them both separately. But first, I should talk about maybe the precedents. Yeah, so this is, of course, we brought communities together that were existing in order to try and build this approach. So there's kind of a historical development that one should be aware of in terms of where holistic security came from. So if we look back probably about 20 years at this point, there was already a lot of tools provided for human rights defenders and communities at risk, which detailed things like basically risk analysis and security and protection planning, which, you know, there were trainings given on it, there were materials created on it. A lot of the tools came sort of, I think, from the humanitarian field more than anything, and it was organizations in an initial moment like, say, Peace Brigades International, and later Frontline Defenders and Protection International, who have really specialized in providing those kind of tools to human rights defenders. So this is stuff like, yeah, context analysis, risk assessment, what are security strategies in broad terms, how can they be implemented, you know, also very concrete tools for analyzing particular situations such as conflict situations, and how then to build security plans and stay safe while carrying out human rights activities in those in those kinds of contexts. And what followed from that is then a discourse that, and series of tools, again, called integrated security, which came mostly from the feminist movement and a number of organizations that are part of the Women Human Rights Defenders International Coalition. And it built certainly on those tools that were already there, but it had a very strong emphasis on actually reclaiming this word security, because I felt that the word security is also overloaded with meanings that actually can be overwhelmingly negative in how people perceive them. This is because the state tends to define security for us as citizens in terms of how it's seen in a legal perspective, and the sort of tools that are used in order to enforce security, you know, the sort of apparatus of police and military and so on. And since so many human rights defenders are also operating in militarized contexts, and since so many attacks against human rights defenders actually come from the security apparatuses, there was a bit of a rebellion against accepting that definition. And I think it was seen as very important that one explicitly reclaims the meaning of the word and redefines it from a perspective that's much more consistent with what human rights defenders are actually fighting for. So as a part of this movement, a very important axis of their work had to do with the notion of well-being and care among activists, among human rights defenders, and even the sort of enjoyment of activism, and seeing all of this not as, like, you know, that well-being isn't something that you that you do as a kind of a luxury, but rather it's actually a political act. It's about sustaining yourself and sustaining your ethics and sustaining your action in defense of those ethics. Very important, there was a couple of good publications about that. One of them was called "What's the Point of Revolution If We Can't Dance?" I think it was by Jane Barry and Jelena Georgievich, and that can be found somewhere online. And I really recommend it to anyone who wants to get an introductory perspective on where this came from. And the other thing that's out there as well is the Integrated Security Manual, which is mostly for trainers, but there's some very good exercises in there that anyone can learn to do, I think, and they can really enrich a training, even if the training isn't fundamentally about well-being, right? Then the other thing that the other sort of community that we engaged, and that's very important to recognize, is that there's a lot of work been done on psychosocial accompaniment of human rights defenders. This is often in the case of, for example, an organization like the Center for Victims of Torture, because many human rights defenders are survivors of torture and abuse. So there's been a psychosocial accompaniment of a number of human rights defenders, and they've had sort of access to tools in that regard. And more recently, there's an organization, for example, in Mexico called Aluna, who explicitly do psychosocial accompaniment of human rights defenders. That's about having a framework, really creating a space to understand the psychological impact, the psychosocial impact of living with risk, and how the violence outside of an organization, be it from the state or from organized crime or from delinquency or from family and community, can be sort of imported into an organization. So what's the violence like inside the organization? How does this happen? Where does it come from? And how do we transform our own collectives and organizations in order to later be able to transform society? And so yeah, there's some excellent material out there on that, primarily though in Spanish in the case of Aluna, but hopefully one day it's going to get translated. There is one good manual which is called, I think, Organizations Under Pressure But Powering On, which was just recently published by the Berghoff Foundation, which also gives a great introductory a great introduction to the psychosocial approach. And yeah, then of course the other community that was very important in developing this, and the tools and everything that were out there already, is about digital security, right? Because more and more dependence on digital tools among human rights defenders has led, of course, to more electronic surveillance, more desire for those who are seeking to stop the work of human rights defenders to have access to their information, to their sensitive information, to put them under surveillance in various different ways. So there's been a number of tools developed in order to help human rights defenders in that regard. And of course, then as a part of that movement, there's the cyber feminist movement as such, which has basically taken a more, actually quite a holistic, in some cases, perspective on digital security and from obviously a gender justice perspective, that looking at the entire chain of production of technology, and how these what we understand in a more narrow sense in terms of surveillance and so on, and proprietary software and the exclusionary aspects of that, is related to injustice and indeed gender injustice in the whole sort of supply chain of technology. So those communities were all very, we tried to engage them as much as possible when we were developing the concept of holistic security, and are trying to maintain an engagement with them and basically try and build common ground and common approaches. I think maybe just one question as well, just that should be noted, is what were our motivations when we began talking about holistic security. So why, essentially, right? The first thing is that, of course, these from the perspective of, if we actually just look at the structures that produce violence against human rights defenders, all of these issues, be it the well-being and self-care, security from a more traditional perspective, digital security, and psychosocial well-being, are interrelated. And if you want to fully explore any of them, you kind of have to explore at least partially the other aspects. So that was something that we felt like, the deeper you go into digital security, the more you find how it relates to, for example, physical or legal aspects. Let's take digital surveillance as an example of something that's often used, for example, in order to gather evidence that might be used in legal cases against human rights defenders. Or surveillance is also a tactic of psychological abuse, essentially, right? So demonstrative surveillance has a very deep psychological impact on human rights defenders. So even though it's not necessarily, that might be digital in origin, or it might be physical in the sense that it's somebody standing outside your office putting you under surveillance, it has a strong psychological impact. So you have to be willing to explore the interrelationship there if you want to fully actually do your job when it comes to physical security or psychosocial well-being or digital security. So there's a minimum language that needs to sort of cross-pollinate. The other thing is that when trainers, particularly and facilitators who are supporting human rights defenders, aren't sufficiently aware of the fundamentals of the other domains, they can give bad advice or inadvertently do harm. So this is when we don't know, for example, enough about how surveillance happens, for example, over particular digital tools. We might just, by virtue of hearsay, give someone advice to use a tool for communication that's not safe in that context, right? So thereby we can kind of put human rights defenders at risk. And of course, nobody can expect to know everything. But it's good to have a dialogue open in order to know enough to avoid putting people at further risk while we're trying to do our individual jobs, at least. The other thing is that, of course, trainers with different understandings were and are contradicting each other. So yeah, just through, again, not willful, but through ignorance of the other domains, we can also, give the same human rights defender who is in 2 different workshops over a period of time contradictory information, and that's not useful for anybody. And yeah, of course, then the training itself, in some circumstances, can itself be an event which attracts a certain amount of interest from the groups, be it state or non-state, who are trying to prevent or obstruct the work of the human rights defenders who are actually taking part in the training. So we have to understand that training and thereby trainers need to be, for example, equipped to carry out a risk assessment of a training, for example, and to understand their own risk, be that digital and or, for example, in the long term, also psychological. As people who support human rights defenders at risk, there's also a risk for us ourselves of things like vicarious trauma, or indeed, depending on the legal context in which we're operating, it could go beyond into sort of judicial harassment and so on. So these were some of our motivating sort of observations, let's say, before we started to work, and they remain relevant, I think. So what I would talk about now is just, again, quite briefly, some fundamentals of the approach in terms of content. So if we imagine, if you have the opportunity to facilitate a process in holistic security for human rights defenders, there's kind of 4 processes really within that I think I put them here as 1, 2, 3, and 4 because perhaps there's an idealized chronological order to them, but in the end they're actually period of time. So the first one, which I think is useful if it comes first as such in a process, is to create spaces, and this is very much from the psychosocial perspective, to create spaces to name the impact that the risk and the violence in society and in the context in which the human rights defenders are working has on the individual human rights defenders and on the collective of human rights defenders, be it an organization or a small group or a media house or otherwise. The violence outside has an impact inside the group, and this is completely normal, but it needs to be named, and it needs to be denaturalized. So a lot of the reactions that we have in terms of just natural emotions like fear, like sadness, like anger, frustration, and like, of course, the kind of conflicts that can arise when a number of people who are scared and who are under huge pressure in terms of financial precarity and very high workloads and high expectations of them from the communities they're trying to work for. Of course, sort of a certain amount of conflict can arise, and it's just very important to sort of name that, to recognize that it's there, and to denaturalize it, and to say that it's not normal for us to have to live with violence, that it's not okay, and that we're coming at this work in defense of human rights with principles and with ideals. And I think that those ideals need to be named as well, these values, because there's something that people can rally around. They need to be kind of really treasured, and they can become a kind of engine for later work on things like well-being and communication and sort of group care. So that would be the sort of first step. Then obviously, once that's been recognized, you can try and engage with basically opening processes and engaging with tools for carrying out a risk assessment and a context assessment. So the idea is that you need to come to some kind of an agreement about what the risks are concretely that you're facing, and actions to be taken in order to lower the risk that these things could happen. So there needs to be a process open for that, and of course it's all about our perceptions. Therefore, it's useful if it's a collective process, of course, and it's useful if we've already dealt with this, let's say, emotional aspect of things, because otherwise that can certainly interfere in what our perception is of the risks that we face. And thereby we also need to go through this process in order to avoid trying to, well, in order to avoid just doing the easy thing, looking for easy answers, and then ending up with a false sense of security. So once we've carried out that analysis, then the third step is to create plans and strategies in order to mitigate those risks and respond to those risks. And there's a number of tools that can be used in order to sort of understand different ways that can be done. And there's lots of material out there, and one of the materials that goes into details on that is the Holistic Security Guide, of course. And the fourth is, yeah, once we've made plans and stuff, it's quite normal that we'll also note that there are certain capacities that we lack in order to really respond to the risks that we face. So noting those capacities that need to be built, or resources that need to be sort of either purchased or whatever, and then going through a process of capacity building and procurement, basically, of the resources necessary. And this is where maybe you learn about encryption, or you have a training about you know, relaxation techniques and stress management and self-care, or you have a training about you know, how to remain safe in a conflict zone. But that should really, you know, identifying the capacities to be built should follow that process of you know, of analysis. You know, a lot of the time, I think human rights defenders and also organizations that are a little bigger, maybe sort of development and aid organizations, have access to trainings, very generic trainings on you know, how to behave in a conflict situation. It's not that they're a bad idea, but they may, what you learn in those trainings may not actually correspond to the actual needs on the ground where you're going. So that's why these first three steps, among other things, are particularly useful. And then, as a facilitator, I think for facilitators and trainers, there's a few. I mean, very few of us have the opportunity to facilitate a whole holistic process. So then, what can we do? I think the process actually of engagement between the different communities who were involved began with more a search for minimums, rather than, you know, really expecting that any of us could at the time change our organizational contexts so greatly as to be able to oversee a whole sort of holistic security program, although some organizations do have that opportunity. But yeah, I mean, just as someone who's maybe just focusing on well-being, or just focusing on digital security, or just focusing on risk assessment, the guiding question for us when we were engaging with each other was, what's the minimum I need to know about your job in order to do my job correctly? So it goes back to that first point I mentioned about, in order to fully explore any of these areas, we need to know a minimum about the others. So there's an implicit myth busting here, of course, which is that, and I think a lot of people had the idea that trainers or facilitators were supposed to turn into some kind of, you know, sort of unicorns who were going to be experts in all of these fields. There aren't enough hours in the day, you know, there isn't enough funding for it. There's just no, you know, the resources aren't there for this to be the case for everybody. I mean, we're lucky if we have any trainer or any facilitator who can actually, you know, really go deep on all of these areas and stay up to date about them. So much more fundamental, we found, was that for facilitators and for trainers, we have to walk the talk as such. What does that mean? It means understanding that your work as a facilitator and as a trainer is also work in defense of human rights. If you support human rights defenders, you're sort of, by virtue of doing that, are a human rights defender. You also face risks as a result of that. You also, you know, they might not be the same risks as the communities that you're supporting, of course, but as I've already mentioned, you know, we're supporting people at risk, and those risks have ways of sort of socializing themselves. So it begins, we begin with the process of walking the talk, which means actually understanding that, and then you as an individual or as an organization who's supporting these people actually looking at the impact psychosocially of this work on your collective and on you as an individual, looking at your risks and making plans, looking at the sensitive information that you manage, where it is, who has access to it, and so on, and how you should protect that, especially given that you're supporting communities who might be, particularly, threatened. And yeah, then building your capacities in correspondence with the context that you have. So I think that's the first thing that anyone who wants to engage with the holistic security approach, or who wants to say that they offer holistic security trainings or processes or whatever to human rights defenders, I think has to actually practice what they preach. That's the most fundamental thing. Another very useful activity is co-facilitation. So this is a place where we've learned a huge amount from each other as well. Some of us who are more deeply involved in the community. I think actually bringing someone along with you, if you can find the funds to do it, or if someone's able to do it pro bono, who has a complementary skill set. So even if you're just giving a 4-day workshop on digital security, or a 3-day or 2-day workshop on digital security, or whatever your primary focus is, you can bring someone else who can at least carry out some exercises to, let's say, give participants the bigger picture, which is the next point, and also to deal with anything that comes up in the group. So it can be that you find your group is suffering hugely in terms of stress, or perhaps vicarious trauma, or that there's a conflict in the group that's actually potentially a threat to your digital security training. Having someone there who's got skills on mediation and well-being and so on can really it makes the process much richer, and you can also control for some of these unexpected sides of things. And the same goes obviously for no matter what the skill set is, they'll bring something, so we've also been encouraging people who focus on self-care and well-being to include little hack lab sessions or whatever with a digital security trainer who can actually answer those questions about WhatsApp and Signal and Telegram and Wire and so on. So that also makes your life a lot easier, and then you can also mirror with that person. They help you to see things in the group and in the context which you might not have seen otherwise. So that's a really great practice that I really want to encourage people who are facilitating and training to actually engage with if they can. Of course, co-facilitate. If you're going to co-facilitate, do it in a structured way so that things don't get confusing for participants, because they shouldn't have to make the leap between one domain and another. You should try and make that as clear and as straightforward as possible for them. The next point was, of course, to give participants the big picture, even if you're focusing on the small picture. So just try and put them in the scene. Try and recognize the importance of the other domains, even though you're focusing on one of them. And actually, Sergey and Nora and I worked on one sample exercise, for example, that people could do in trainings, no matter what the focus of the training is, in order to give participants that bigger picture. So that's in the Holistic Security Facilitators Guide, which you can find on the website of the Holistic Security Manual, which Tactical Tech published last year. So that is an idea, but there's lots of different ideas you could come up with, and in terms of ways to bring participants into the bigger picture. And the last thing that is just useful is to have dialogue and support from other organizations that are coming at protection of human rights defenders from a different perspective and with a different emphasis. Just taking advantage of whatever space is possible to sit down and chat with them, because it might be that you're actually supporting the same organization or the same human rights defender, and that you could gain a huge amount of useful insight from each other through just being in touch. So looking for those spaces and taking advantage of them, and then that opens doors to things like co-facilitation, or even you yourself receiving support, as someone who's supporting HRDs yourself, in a field that you're not necessarily very comfortable with, from a sort of career perspective, or from a content perspective. I think that's my last slide. Yeah, that's my last slide. So I'll leave it there for now.
Quite a few of you who have signed up for this webinar had indicated that they're quite interested in the training process and how to support human rights defenders. So I felt it may be good to actually share our experience. As an organization, we work with human rights defenders around the globe and have been engaged in capacity building processes as well. So I would like to share our experiences, and I've entitled the presentation "How to Start and Maintain a Process on Security with Human Rights Defenders," because in our experience, it's actually not a one-off session. It's a process that needs growing and how can I say, recurrent engagement with defenders. We often have defender approach us or have partners approach us asking for support on security and protection. And oftentimes is a result of experience that defenders organizations have had. And so it's been a need that has been identified. What we also realize is that when we talk about needs, realize that the people involved in this process, the HRDs themselves, the donors, the facilitators, and even people that the HRDs are standing up for, they have very different expectations and needs and priorities towards this process. And they can be overlapping, they can contradict themselves. There can also be power relations. So just as an example, you have a donor who has a lot of goodwill and feels this organization is at risk and they've had security incidents, and so there's enough indication that they're at risk, but they have a very set way of thinking of how the organization should move towards improving their security. Often in a very formalized way, something that they can tick boxes with simply because it's helpful and it fits within their frame, not from a negative point of view. And the HRDs being on the ground in their contexts with the dynamics around them, seeing things slightly differently. So the needs that are formulated sometimes differ and sometimes be very, very difficult to actually formulate where things should be going in a process. And that gets to the point that everybody thinks that training is so let's have a training and everything will be okay, everyone will be safe and secure, and nothing's going to happen in the future. Out of my experience, because training is something we've all had, is something concrete that everybody can rely on. From an organizational or a management point of view, it's also concrete in the sense it's timeline, it has specific costs, we can report on it, we take pictures, we can document it. This is very important. It's something tangible. It's also easy because someone comes, stands in front of you, and that's it. At the end of the day, we write a report. And the responsibility for the outcomes can also be kind of outsourced, let me call it that, to the trainer. Trainer who has to make sure that the training is successful. But that is actually not the case in most instances. It's not that the trainer can actually lead you through a successful training because security is slightly different than, let's say, a new accounting software. And it does not work in isolation. We need to think about strengthening and supporting human rights defenders in their security management and protection more as a process, with a training, or as I prefer it, a workshop, just as one where you may be able to share tools, etc. But it's not the one fit all solution to human rights defenders' needs. So we need to rethink, as stakeholders that are working with and for human rights defenders, we need to rethink our approach in supporting them. So away from training as a default activity, as something that can be ticked, that can be put in a work plan, and after this we have concrete results and changes. We need to start thinking on process, something that takes time, because integrating security in security consciousness and security practices in your daily work as a human rights defender is, there is no one-fit-all approach. Human rights defenders, their work, their organizational setups, their personality, all that is different from one to the next, even if you're working in the same country on similar things. So the accompaniment to human rights defenders has to be tailored to their setup, to their desires. Refrain from compartmentalizing security management and protection. We all know why we still say physical, in quotes, digital and psychosocial, because it helps to illustrate points for in our area of work. But essentially it's important for us to provide comprehensive support to human rights defenders and try to avoid this kind of approach because it's artificial. There's nothing, there are very few threats that do not reach out from one domain into the others. And that's important to convey so that we also do not create a false sense of security when we say, hey, you've done your digital security training, all is good. It's not that way. So even in our own heads, I think it's important to move to a more comprehensive understanding of security. Also refraining from prescriptive measures, meaning checklists, and they'll all be good because those checklists are comprehensive and they work. There may be very important points on checklists, but it's about how do you integrate that into the consciousness and practice. So it's for a human rights defender and their organizations to realize that security and protection is something they can actually do something about. Consciously looking through their work through a security lens in how they're working and see where some of their practices, some of their behavior, their engagement with stakeholders, dynamics in their work environment impact on their security and what can be done. Moving away from developing security measures. Many of the defenders working have been working on sensitive issues for years and years and years, and they're still there. And that means they're doing something right. So it's not for us to come tell them and develop security measures for them, but rather recognizing what's already in place, analyzing why some things work, what keeps them safe, and together continue that reflection, see are there gaps, are there opportunities that could actually strengthen this further, and building on practices, integrating it into their way of working. So that brings again this accompaniment aspect. We need to recognize that oftentimes we're coming from outside, even if we're working in the same country, oftentimes coming as an outsider to an organization. So learning, reading, reflecting together with a group and moving jointly towards something, that's our role. So basically being a facilitator rather than a trainer. Then something that is also up in another project, the unique trainer. Think me as an individual trainer or facilitator for all aspects of security protection equally well. That's probably not the case. So the opportunity to work in teams of professionals, and that also goes to donors, a rethinking of recognizing that this is a process, recognizing that it touches all realms of human rights defenders' work and is highly contextualized. It would be great if we have the opportunity to work in teams so that we can support defenders more comprehensively and in depth in that process. And then to simplifying change, that again goes back to the issue of what are we expecting as a result of this process. I think there will be a training, everybody's highly motivated, everybody sees the point, but everybody also goes back to their desk on a Monday morning and realizes already going on, things we've agreed, things we're doing out of routine, things that have proven effective. how do we start integrating security issues into this process? And that is not easy. It requires a change of mind, a change of practice, a change of policies and structures in an organization. So we must be, this is complex, and we must be aware that every organization is somehow imperfect because they're run by human beings. So what is on paper oftentimes not how it works on a daily basis, but how it works on a daily basis affects the security of the individual and the organization. So we have to be frank, we have to reflect on it, and that has to be integrated in any kind of plans and solutions that are developed with and by human rights defenders is the very important part there. And why should we do that holistically? Well, I think are not one-dimensional, meaning we are not just one thing. So security cannot be divided into separate parcels and handled separately. The actions we take are not only falling within a specific area. When I'm sitting on my computer writing emails with sensitive content, this is not only a digital action. There are potential other risks. Then the question is, what is security? We need to realize that security is a very personal concept. If we ask 10 people who are part of this webinar, what is security to you? The answer would always differ. And it would differ maybe even from a day-to-day basis, because what makes you feel secure is personal. It's also situational, depending on the situation you're in right now, and an emotional, what have you experienced, etc. So if we are to support meaningfully, we must understand this. The security is not a tick box issue. It's something that people are emotional about, that needs to be initiated within organizations, because organizations are made up of many people with their experiences, with their fears, with their hopes, with their way of doing things. So that's why we have to look at all different aspects, and we have to recognize especially that aspect of emotions that drive our experience and also our reflections, our needs. And lastly, that threats to HIV security do not fall one category. So when we actually analyze and think of solutions or responses to specific things, must be multidimensional too. Meaning that if we think only one aspect of response, we're probably exposing ourselves even more. Let's say when we think about the physical security of the office, then that may not protect us against the kind of threat that we are facing. So being holistic when working with human rights defenders is not only about what topics you cover, whether you tell people how to use a password on their phone and things like that, but it's about how inclusive, respectful, and responsive to their needs the whole process is. And it also means to those, like, how you involve all those that are affected. So that's the organization as an institution, the individuals involved, but also how you act, behave, engage, and negotiate yourself around this process as a facilitator, but also how donors are involved in that process. So holistic in the sense, being inclusive, being respectful and responsive, I think, to the complexities of the work of human rights defenders and their security and protections. So what can facilitators do achieve this to integrate these values or this approach into their work? I think first and foremost is to listen, to be willing to learn. I personally feel I always take a huge amount of learning away from working with groups or individuals, from their context, from their existing strategies, from their motivation to do this kind of work. And that really shapes in how I adapt the process of of working with them, and that's important. You obviously have your standard things that you want to convey, some hard skills, but how you bring that across and how it is most meaningful to the group, that's really important to learn. And you do that, I think, also by listening, by getting a feel of who they are. Sharing with those can be of help, with those that can support the process further, with those that can support you as a facilitator with this specific group or with this specific individual, because they have relevant information and experience and can point you to an even better way. I think is the buy-in, creating ownership of the process that must involve the management. They have the power, the influence to create the initial space, to put it on the agenda, to be a reminder of things that have been agreed on, but most importantly, everyone involved. So feeling that this is a common cause, being able to create that would be your guarantee, I'd say, to carry this forward and to make it become what this organization or these individuals want it to be. And maintaining this, getting a feel for when this drops and when you need to kind of see and bring people back together and seeing that this is something worthwhile to spend their time on, because there's a clear benefit for them and the organization. Be accessible. As facilitators, we come in externally, we have a chance to work with people in person for short periods of time. But actually, as we're talking about a process is also a certain continuum, sometimes more intensive than on other times. But I think it's very important that trust and have become a partner in this process to the organization or to the individuals is to be accessible, so that once things happen, once obstacles occur, there's a person to reflect with. So open that space, make yourself be available, even if it's out of the agreed schedule, because that's also what the process is about. It is shaped by the experiences, by what happens around the HRDs in their context, and therefore it's unpredictable. So that can also be negotiated maybe with a donor to have a few days that but it allows for ad hoc support that cannot be planned, that is hard to anticipate. Follow up and document. Help the organization who continues their human rights work, who's engaged, who's busy, who's overwhelmed with so many things, to remind them of some of the commitments they've made, to give pointers of what could be helpful at certain junctions in their time, etc. So keep that momentum, help them to keep the momentum. You can't keep the momentum yourself, but help them by being there to remind them, to inject ideas, to share information, to make contacts that could be useful, and document the process for yourself as a learning process, for fellow facilitators as a learning opportunity, but also for the organization, because that's also the point. Contribute to the organizational learning and the memory, the organizational memory of how this has come about, how it's been built, how it can be taken forward through new changes that the organization goes through. The Never Walk Alone is also about how we can actually be better facilitators if we're able to reflect. When I work alone with a group, I have a lot of ideas and thoughts at the end of, let's say, a workshop, or when I've had meetings, and it would help me. It helps me a lot, and it would help me even more to do that more consistently, to share with peers, to think through ideas, to not let things drop where they are. So for us, each one of us, to create a small network of peers that can be that an hour of exchanging ideas after activity with a group, that can be helpful to strengthen ourselves, to increase our, even more of a resource to our partners. And very importantly, as a facilitator, don't accept responsibility for the outcome. We said earlier, security and protection is something very individual, specific to every organization, every individual working in it, and where they want to take it. We can only facilitate this process. We can't carry the process for them. And that's very important, I think, to recognize. Also, to state and to have it formulated with the group at the beginning, And I think it becomes clearer to them as you go forward. Also importantly, to, I think, discuss with the donor how important it is that this process comes from the organization and that you provide your expertise to support it, but that you are not the one who's responsible for the outcome. So that takes also away some of the pressure we feel when we see that things do not go as we expected and that we, or as we had hoped, because we're also highly motivated when we work with organization. And it relates to the issue of every organization has their own imperfections and every process changes along the way. Let's be open to those changes, do the best as we can, but the responsibility lies with our partners, lately. We discuss this more, to share experiences that you have had when working with groups or individuals, to see what we can do to support each other. So please use the forum, the collaborative space that is provided here. Would be nice to hear from you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Dear colleagues, thank you Curidocs, and thanks TTC and everyone who attended this small but important event. Can you hear me still?
Yeah.
We are pleased to be here and talk about such an important topic as holistic security. My name is Sergey Smirnov, and I'm a trainer and author on digital security matters for human rights activists and independent journalists. I live in Moscow, Russia.
Hi, Daniel. Lipin, hi. Also from Moscow. I'm a lawyer and special interested in information technologies.
My name is Natalia Solovyova. I'm in Siberia. I also work closely with civil rights activists, and we lost our presentation. So please address us as Sergey, Daniel, and Natalia if you wish to ask questions or discuss holistic security. Daniel, Sergey. Okay, so let's start with describing our friend Tanya. Tanya is an LGBT activist who works in one of the regions of Russia. In this moment, she travels to visit international LGBT conference abroad. Tanya has some psychological knowledge and skills to deal with stress and pressure. She carefully monitors the security of her gadgets and things. She got her sensitive data prepared, uploaded to the cloud, and wiped it from her laptop. Also, based on the Russian realities, she set password on her smartphone. In the airport, she is asked to provide her smartphone passport to the immigration officer. She doesn't know what to do, and she was worried about possible legal negative consequences. So she provided her passport. Tanya was rather good in psychological, physical, digital rights, but she wasn't that good in legal issues. This appeared to be her weakest spot, and the adversary used it against her.
Next slide. Our approach is based on a 4-component model. We believe that holistic security is about digital, physical, psychological, and legal issues. Based on the digital security issues, we are trying to help our target audience understand mutual connection between components. This gives them the feeling that these 4 parts from their holistic security. For information, we see that legal security is legal. It's about dealing with specific issues associated with legal aspects of human rights activity. Sometimes legal accidents are almost impossible to remove if they already happened. So the only way to deal with them is to predict them and take measures. Next slide, please. We do trainings, give consultations, and work on educational materials. In 2016 and 2017, we organized a series of trainings and workshops on holistic security for human rights defenders. We worked out some successful training technologies, such as about phishing and cyberbullying. Natasha, right?
Correct.
For example, we had a successful sessions of different possible actions online, including likes and reposts and in other activity and social networks. And the legal and psychological consequences that may follow. We've used educational materials on holistic security issued by colleagues, get feedback from our target groups, and adapt this material to their needs and expectations. For example, we used the results of the group work of different security trainers in Berlin in April 2015 to build a checklist to save unsafe space for organizers and facilitators of events. Sorry. We've also worked out some materials from scratch. Next.
When I started computer trainings years ago, I believed that I needed all time for tools and practices. Holistic security approach helped me to understand that my trainees often arrived to trainings being under pressure already and suffering from stress due to their main job. It's hard for them to focus on rather unknown and difficult digital things. To make trainings more effective, we started them with questions like, how do you feel today? This was a small step towards a safer environment. People felt more comfortable and the training process became easier. During our trainings, we pay special attention to psychological conditions of our trainees. We also begin paying more attention to confidentiality. Now we don't discuss or expose to third parties any sensitive information about vulnerabilities, policies, protocols, and decisions made by people whom we assist. Also, we used to highlight Chatham House Rule, physical security of premises, Wi-Fi security, and many other things that may influence the well-being of our trainees. So let's forget about encryption. While many other educators traditionally start with threats, we consider values to be our entry point to the whole topic. Our first steps in holistic security training are that we discuss what are the most important things people want to keep safe. This actually opened people's eyes. They feel incident happening. It's about their values that need to be protected all the time, whatever they do, wherever they go. People stop thinking about security as a continuous process of waiting for and responding to different new threats. It's about getting ready, being effective, and feeling safe.
We recommend people preparing both security policies, measures to be taken to avoid bad things happening, and emergency protocols. First step to be done if bad things already happened. A security policy is a set of measures that help us to prevent bad things from happening. An emergency protocol is a set of quick steps we should make in case of that bad things already happened. Lowering risk and avoiding incidents are preferable indeed. Next.
Did this approach prove to be fruitful? Yes. First, it's become easier to start the training. Indeed, Tanya was already under stress and she found out herself on a training with a company of people whom she didn't know well enough. It was hard to talk about sensitive things such as vulnerabilities. We invested into making this process smooth, so Tanya felt herself in a more comfortable way and safe environment. This couldn't be done by any digital exercise or a simple icebreaker only. We needed holistic security approach for this. Then we could talk not only about abstract things, but welcome Tanya to talk about her situation. So it helped us to make the whole training closer to Tanya's actual needs. Holistic security approach allows us to make our trainings more interactive. This includes usage of computer programs, countering cyberbullying and phishing, the development of emergency protocols and their implementation, and much more. people don't focus on protecting things like computers, smartphones, offices. Instead, they are trained to protect their values like information, freedom, health, and many others. We don't just come and demonstrate a good piece of software. Instead, we work on changing attitudes and practices. We also analyze threats from different positions. Questions are not readdressed. We try to answer most questions, so Tanya does not receive answers like, better go ask your psychologist or digital expert or lawyer. In some situations, it's difficult to people to follow a specific advice because of various reasons. For example, it seems too technically difficult. In this case, people often leave things unchanged. Then we give them several advices from different points of view. There are better chances that they will try at least some of actions that we recommended, and the situation will be improved. The situation with human rights in Russia has been constantly getting worse. Tanya and her colleagues face new threats. Her group doesn't have any security policy. The group installs strong doors and windows in their office, but does nothing to improve psychological climate. Holistic security is still something new to the community. People used to ask for assistance in particular spheres like digital security or legal matters, but they rarely connect them with each other. Tanya is a pretty advanced person, but usually has troubles with the implementation of security practices in her group, because her colleagues are all of different background, and it's hard to her to implement security measures in her group. This situation is accompanied with the lack of motivation and discipline and resources.
Okay. There are some steps we can make to help out Tanya. First, it's always better. Can you hear me?
Yep.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. It's always better to go to Tanya's city or town and work with her and her organization there. We can spend time in the atmosphere where Tanya works. We even can check her working space and do elements of security audit. This allows us to give more detailed and relevant advices. Then we have managed to extend our audience from human rights defenders only to other categories, independent journalists, for instance, and this step allowed us to broaden our horizons much. For example, journalists have had accumulated more experience in social networks than human rights defenders. We are always open to Tanya's requests. For example, she can contact us by different channels of communication such as email or Jitsi Meet or Facebook Messenger and ask questions related to security. It's very important to share experience with other educators, trainers, digital security specialists, consultants, and authors of various educative materials. We are open to cooperation and ready to make steps forward. It's also important to look for resources so we could organize longer trainings and more efficient ones, visit workshops to share experience and conferences and work on different materials. Sadly, many people still don't know that such thing as holistic security exists. While it's understandable for general human rights audience, it's not acceptable when we talk about educators. Still, good experts are often focused on their own sectors. Say, we will talk about legal issues before lunch and computer issues are postponed for after lunch. Basic understanding and acceptance of the holistic security model is a must to move further. One of our biggest interests is methodology. We wish to know more about how our colleagues work and share our own experience. To get this, visiting an international conference would be a good step forward, and participating in someone's training would be also fruitful. Next, while there are tons of manuals on digital tools and devices, as well as articles on psychology or online step-by-step instructions on legal matters, we still have very little on holistic security and almost nothing in Russian language and adapted to the Russian situation. Indeed, we lack resources, human resources, time and funding. We would like to be able to go to regions in our team of 3 experts, legal, psychological, and digital, but it's common that the organizers and donors have funds and willing to pay for 1 expert only. So it's common also that people want to have a full security training in a very short period of time. We want to have a complete security training in 1.5 days, for instance. And it's impossible, we'll know that. Sometimes there are events organized by our colleagues, and we would love to attend them and share experience there. So the final word, holistic security, what I wanted to say, isn't made of having yet another training or writing yet another article. It's rather new to our sphere. And so let's do brainstorming, use fresh and interesting examples, and practice different exercises, and so on and so forth. And also be communicative, stay open for colleagues and trainees, and share our experience as much as possible. This is what we wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really such a great presentation. So we just have a couple of questions that have been shared. So I'll go over those, and then I'm hoping that the presenters might have a couple questions for each other. So the 2 questions that have been shared so far relate to resources. One person would like Daniel to repeat the reference of the manual recently published. I assume that this is the Holistic Security Manual. Dan, do you want to say anything more about this?
Sure. So that's the Holistic Security Manual. On the one hand, was I think maybe published a year and a half ago, and I worked on that a lot with Ali and Craig and Sandra Ljubinkovic, and also Nora was involved as a reviewer in that. And so that's, I think, the longest material in the English language about it that's available at the moment. And then there's actually, I responded to that question on Twitter already, because there's a facilitator's manual. Actually, if you flick through the website, so this is one for facilitators, there's a resources section, I think, and in there, then you'll find the facilitator's manual, which also Sergey was involved in. And so that's, I think, the one in particular that I mentioned. So that's also quite, in there you find different types of, on the one hand, there's stuff about principles, about how to facilitate or work, let's say, from a holistic perspective. And then there's also concrete exercises that you can do with the group, whether they're quite general or they're following a particular flow. There's a series of exercises, for example, about risk assessment that you can follow. Just to say, there's one more resource that occurs to me for Spanish speakers, which is basically a manual for land rights defenders, which one of our colleagues, Moritz, wrote, and I guess I can put the link to that into the chat. So for Spanish speakers, that's a very good manual. It's a little shorter, and it's focused particularly on land rights defending and in rural communities in Latin America. But for anyone who's interested, yeah, I'll gladly share that one with the group in the chat.
Great, thanks. And we'll collect these resources and share them in the summary, and we can also share them in the collaboratory discussion thread. Nora, Sergey, Daniil, or Natalia, do you have any other holistic security resources that you'd like to share?
Nothing that I can think of immediately, but if there's something that comes to my mind, I will post it in the, what do you call it?
The collaboratory?
Thank you. Sorry, I know there was something like, okay, yes, exactly. Yeah, I'm sure there's something that I would recommend, but yeah, right now it's, yeah.
Great.
Our situation is that what we use to work on is mostly in Russian language. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that many people here can read it.
That's probably true, but it would still be great to get that information from you. But I think I'll get it from you over email or in the collaboratory discussion forum. That way people can refer to it when they need it. Thanks for sharing that, though. Okay, there's a couple other questions coming in, so I'm going to move on. But if anybody else on the call thinks of other resources, please go ahead and share those in the chat or share them on Twitter using the hashtag Herodox. So another question's coming in here from Benny. For community human rights defenders, language is the biggest barrier in understanding the security aspect. Do you have any tips on how to bridge that gap? Because human rights defenders working on the grassroots are the most vulnerable. This case is especially happening in the Asian countries.
Yeah, that's very relevant. Although it's difficult, just because exactly as he says, the context matters a lot. I think what's to be avoided is to arrive. I think, especially, I mean, for those of us who are based in the West and sort of traveling to do trainings and to do kind of accompaniment and so on, it's better not to force a framework on people, but rather to actually facilitate. And that's why the difference between facilitation and training is very important. And obviously to work ideally with local people who understand the context quite well. I think maybe I think Nora just dropped out, but I know Protection International have also done some work on, for example, like I think it was in Central America, in developing a manual that was also aimed at, for example, community-based and rural human rights defenders that presented the issue and the concepts in completely different language. So I think that's a great principle to work by. That's also working with the community so that they develop their own language around the concepts, so that they can see to what extent it resonates, with their cultural context and with their linguistic context and so on. Because I think the bad practice, of course, is just to come in with a framework that's really not going to resonate and just try and force it. But it's unfortunate. I don't think there's a huge amount of materials out there on that, but I'll fish out this one from Protection International now and share it because it was quite good. I think there was a couple more as well for different contexts.
We also have one in Bahasa, I think. And then as Protection International, we have protection desks in Thailand and Indonesia. Obviously, those are just two countries. But with these desks working very closely with communities, actually focusing much more on community-based organizations. So if there's interest, I can also post the contacts to reach out, because they may also over a period of time have worked with groups that are able to share with other communities. So like thinking of kind of peer exchanges that could be maybe facilitated, things of that sort. Maybe we need to put more thinking into these kind of things, because I guess resources won't be there to translate each and everything. And as Dan said, not every framework can be adapted for every context. But I think there are more and more facilitators, trainers around. So how can we make use of this and have and reach further?
Thank you. Does anybody else have anything to share on this question about language? Okay, there are a few other questions here. Donat has a question. As a trainer in digital security, can you define security and vulnerability levels for human rights defenders, such as low, medium, and high? Is there like a framework for how you might do this, or something that you would recommend?
Whom you address this question?
You, whoever would like to try to respond to that.
Okay, I will try until I'm kicked out again. This is actually one of the most difficult questions for me, because I have trained many people, when they arrived at a webinar, for instance, or a seminar or a workshop training from all parts of Russia, for instance, and they were all from different organizations. So I think that this is almost impossible to define precisely these levels, to define them for such a group. You only can do this probably when you work closely with a particular organization, and the best way is to go there and to to observe them in action. You probably just spend a day there with the organization and look how they work, because sometimes they just cannot have enough information. A person comes from a remote city, from somewhere in Siberia, and this lady is, say, the leader of the organization, or probably a technical director or whatever, and she doesn't know everything that happens in her own group, or probably she cannot give you exact information about this or that thread. For instance, she has nothing with the website of their organization. The website is run by some other guy living in, say, Germany, remotely, and they don't have any information about that. So probably one of the biggest threats for them is a DDoS attack, or something like that. Or probably they can be blocked by the Russian government, so they need to think about circumvention tools for their readers and so on and so forth. But you cannot guess that from the training, during the training, when they all come from different organizations in one place. So you need to go there, and the best way would be to make a security audit. Then you feel, you get more detailed information about what are their vulnerabilities, and you see them. Even sometimes it happened that, we approached the local technician, and he said, we all have antivirus installed everywhere. And then we checked their computers one by one and saw that half of them didn't have any antivirus software at all. And he didn't know about that because they removed this antivirus software by their own hands, because they were allowed doing this. They had administrative rights and so on and so forth. So this could be a big threat for them, but they didn't know that before we got there and discovered there on their computers. So it's a really difficult question, which one you asked. And it should be treated individually in each case. I cannot accept the practice that some trainers do, as they tell people, no, please, gather all together and let's work on, some common model, and let's talk about, do you think that a DDoS attack is a big threat, of high importance for you, or of low importance for you? They may even have no idea about what is DDoS attack first, and some risks are very, very hidden. They may not know.
I think we lost Sergey there, but he'll be back. Here we go.
Fantastic. Okay, so I think that I talked a lot. So the short answer would be that no, I cannot do this for the big group. I can only do that for an individual group after working with them closely.
Thanks, Sergey. Nora, did you have something that you wanted to add?
I think I'd follow what Sergey is saying. Medium, high, low is very individual. It can even be differing within an organization. And I think if we want to rank it that way, it's also part of when we're trying to rationalize security. What the tool we use sometimes to help organization prioritize certain threats is to think of how likely are things in your context, or what have you already experienced, and how harmful would this event be to you. So that can kind of give you at least a certain idea, but that's not how can I say, a scientific measurement of the level of risk. So and that is also where I think the issue of negotiating within an organization of what the priorities are and what our common understanding of security is, that comes in there. So I would answer, I don't think there's a scientific way in a mathematical sense. It's a lot about discussing in a group, understanding your context, see what has happened, analyzing incidents, analyzing strategies that opposing forces use. that can give you an idea to then make decisions of how you want to react as a group, or in some cases as an individual.
Thank you both for responding to that question. It sounds like assessing vulnerability is just very complicated, and each situation is different. I wonder if there are any helpful frameworks that have been documented that you could share. Dan, does anything come to mind, or any of the other presenters?
Not really, because I think that it's pretty context dependent.
Okay.
You know, even if we say that, you know, a relatively high level of surveillance for one human rights defender might be might you know, lead to quite a high risk of, let's say, criminalization or an attack. In another context, it may not have that same. It might not imply that those further risks are there. And, you know, I've come across stories of human rights defenders who are under a huge amount of surveillance, and they themselves take to actually video recording everything that they're doing, because it's a way of demonstrating that everything that they do is constitutionally legitimate. So just as one little example, you know, it's very difficult to say sort of, you know, without any knowledge of the context, whether this or that is higher risk than something else, but rather we need the tools to actually analyze the situation in accordance with that context. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. There's another question here that we have time to respond to before we wrap up. Are these resources out there that integrate rights are there resources out there that integrate rights documentation training with security? Is anybody familiar with anything like that?
If you guys didn't write them. No, I don't know of any as such, but it would be a great resource.
Sorry, could you, what you mean, violations of human rights? I mean, human rights violations and security? I didn't get the question fully.
Yes, let me repeat it. Are there any resources that exist that discuss human rights documentation, as in documenting human rights violations, that kind of training, along with security? So addressing both the ways that human rights defenders can document violations, along with how can they do that securely?
I know that Amnesty International is currently, the Netherlands section, the Dutch section is currently reviewing their kind of manual on this. I guess it will still be a couple of months until it comes out, but it's trying to include aspects of security management in human rights monitoring and documentation. So that's coming up at some point. Yeah. Hello.
Yes.
Okay.
And I'll just add that Heradox does include security with its human rights documentation trainings, but I don't think that we have anything documented for other trainers to use, but that would be a great resource. So I'll bring that back to the team. I could be wrong. If we do have something documented, I'll share it on the forum. I'll just share one last thing from Donat, who is just wanted to share this comment. We train how to protect the data of human rights defenders, on which levels as a trainer in digital security we can prioritize, categorize, and classify the data of the human rights defenders to be secured.
All right, so like maybe there's frameworks out there, for example, for how to classify different types of data. Yeah, I mean, there might be some stuff written out there about it probably from you know, different fields. I don't know if in the context of human rights there's anything written on that, but there's like ISOs on information security and stuff. So there probably is, you know, from the business world or from medical field, for example. There might be something that you could kind of hack but I don't know of anything sort of open source from our community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll think about that too. We can also discuss that in the discussion thread. Okay, let me move on to this last slide so people know how to join this discussion forum. We invite everybody who is listening to this webinar now to continue this discussion on our Herodox Collaboratory, which is an online forum space. I have the URL here on this slide, but you can also just go to collaboratory.herodox.org. The link is also on the Herodox website. And you'll be able to see that there's a topic for holistic security. And the conversation has already been started there, so feel free to start a new topic or reply to what's already there. Share your resources. Yeah, just it's a great opportunity for us to keep talking. Also, I wanted to remind you all that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available. It should be available within an hour after we end. And that's available on the Herodox website. And we'll also be writing up a summary that will be available in a few weeks on that same page on the Herodox website. Okay, I'm sorry that some people are unable to see the slide. I'm happy to share the link in the chat, and I'll also tweet it. Our Twitter account is just @Herodox, so you can find it there as well. Are there any other last questions or comments before we wrap up? Any questions that the presenters might have for each other?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay. And I mean, we can always keep this going in the forum.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I especially want to thank the presenters. I really appreciate all the effort you put into preparing for this webinar. What you've shared has been super helpful, and I'm glad that we have this recorded to use as a resource in the future. And I look forward to continuing the conversation in the forum. Thank you all so much, and thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
a good day, everybody.